In this video, we're going to go through some Python list examples. So in our introductory problem, let's assign the variables YouTube1, YouTube2, YouTube3, YouTube4, YouTube5 to the values 10, 23, 13, 15, and 11, respectively. And these values represent the minutes you spent watching YouTube each day this week. Then, I want you to print the value of the sum and the average of these variables. So let's go ahead and start coding here. Let's name our file intro.py. Let's start off with our menu code here. So we have done equal false. We've got while not done. Let's print out our menu. Let's have I for introduction. Let's have Q for quits. And so let's create a variable called choice, and we'll say input choice, and we'll say if choice equal, I will say print introduction, elif choice, Q for quits, and then we'll set done equal true. That'll exit out a loop. And if the user enters something else, we'll just say invalid choice. So whenever you write some code, you should always test your code too. So let's say Python intro.py. So we've got I for introduction, we've got Q for quits, and if we type in something else, like something else, it says invalid choice. So we're off to a good start. Now, let's go back, and so for our introductory example, we want to create 5 different variables. So we've got YouTube1 equal 10, we've got YouTube2 equal 23, we've got YouTube3 equal 13, we've got YouTube4 equal to 15, and we've got YouTube5 equal to 11. So if you wanted to add up all the numbers, we could just do something like YouTube1 plus YouTube2 plus YouTube3 plus YouTube4 plus YouTube5. And then we could say something like total, and we'll print out the total. Let's go ahead and test that out. So we've got a total of 72 so far. We also want to figure out the average. So let's say average, and the average would be total divided by, we've got 5 numbers. So we'll say print average, and we'll print out average here. So let's run this code again. And so we have got a total of 72, an average of 14.4. Now, let's try that same example, except this time let's use a list. So let's rewrite our code and have a list named YouTube. Think to yourself where in your code you should place your list and why. Should it be before the loop, inside the loop, or outside or after the loop? So also using a for loop, I want you to print out the index and elements of YouTube. Use the header index and elements. That way you know which one is the index and which one's the elements. I also want you to create another for loop and just print out the elements. So let's see how that works here. So first part is, where should you create your list named YouTube? Now if you think about it, if you created the list inside the while loop, every time the while loop looped, it would create the variable and assign it values all over again. So we don't really want to do that here. So that's why it would be before the loop. so let's create our list here. So we got 10, 23, 13, 15, and 11. And we're going to have example 1 here. And let's create a new elif, and we'll say E1, we'll say example 1, and we want to print out the list with a header, so we know our index and the elements. So to do that, we're going to use the kind of C-style way of printing out a list. So we'll have for I in range len list name, and then we'll say print I, and we'll tab that over, and we'll say YouTube bracket I. I'll go ahead and save that. So, by the way, when you work with lists and use a for loop, typically use the variable I, because that stands for index. Alright, so let's test that out right now. So we've got example 1 here, and we've got our index and elements. So we've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. As we talked about before, index values in Python, when working with a list, index values start at 0. Now, let's try the second way of printing out the elements of the list. So if you don't need the index values, we could just say for I in YouTube, and we just print out I. And let's see how that works. So here we have, again, this is the first part, and in the second part here, we're just printing out the elements. Okay, so in this example here, we use the C-style way of doing it, and we had the index, and then we had the elements. And in the second way, if you just needed to use the elements, you could just say for I in YouTube, print out I. Alright. Let's look at example 2 here. So in example 2, we want to print out the maximum, minimum, and sum of YouTube. So Python makes that pretty easy. We'll say E2, example 2, and we'll say elif choice equal E2. We'll say example 2. And again, we want to print out the maximum, minimum, and sum of YouTube. So to do that is pretty easy. We'll just say maximum, and we'll just say max YouTube. If we want the minimum, we'll say minimum min YouTube. And if we wanted the sum, or the total, we'll just say sum YouTube. So when we run it, again, we got sum 72, just like we had for total previously, except we didn't have to create a mathematical formula. All we had to do was just say sum. All right, let's look at example 3 here. So in example 3, we want to print out the first element of YouTube, and then we want to print out the last element of YouTube. So let's see how that works. So let's create another menu item here. We'll say print E3, say example 3, and we'll say elif choice equal E3, print out the first elements is pretty easy. We just have to remember that the index value of the first element is 0. So all it is just YouTube bracket 0. Now the last element is a little trickier because since you start counting at 0, the last element is not necessarily going to be how many elements are in the list. Because we know that when we have len YouTube, that will give us the total number of elements in the list. But the last element is actually going to be -1. So last elements we'll say bracket last here. Because again, the last element is going to be the length of the list -1. Now let's test that out here. So we've got E3, and the first element of the list is 10, and the last element is 11. If we look at our list here, let's verify that. First element 10, last element 11. All right. Example 4. Let's ask the user for a number to search. If the number is in the list, we'll print numbers in the list, else we'll print number is not on the list. All right, so let's create another example here. We'll say example 4. And we'll say lift choice equal E4. And we want to ask the user for a number. So we'll say num, well actually let's do print sample 4. And we'll say num equal, we know that we're looking for a number, so we'll say int input number to search. And we'll say if num in YouTube, we'll say print num is in YouTube, else print num is not in YouTube. So let's give that a try here. So number to search. Well, I'm looking back here, and I know that number 1 isn't there. So let's try 1. So 1 is not in YouTube. Let's try searching for another number. Let's try 13. And we see that 13 is in YouTube. All right, last example. Let's write some code that performs the following tasks. Let's add the element 20 to the beginning of the list. Let's remove the last element of the list. Let's add the element 30 to the third position of the list. Let's add the element 50 to the end of the list. And using a for loop, let's print out the index and elements of the list. All right, so this is a couple of different steps here. So let's work through this carefully. We'll say E5 equal example 5. And we'll say elif choice equal E5. We'll say print example 5. And the first part is, I'll just write a comment to myself here. We're going to add the elements 20 in the beginning of the list. All right, so to add something at the beginning of the list, we're going to have to use the insert function. So we'll have YouTube.insert. Beginning of the list is 0, and we want to put in 20. Okay. Now, just so that we see what's happening behind the scenes, let's just do a little print statement there. We'll just say print YouTube just to see. Now let's go back here. Let's try to run this. So E5 here. Now you notice, again, we started off with 10, 23, 13, 15, 11. And now we've got 20 at the very beginning. Next step here, we've got remove the last element of the list. So remove last element of the list. So to do that, you can just say pop, just like that. Again, let's print out YouTube at the end, which we have right here. Let's see what happens. We've got E5, and again, the last element was 11, and now it's gone. So now the last element is 15. All right, so we're going to, third part is add the elements 30 to the third position of the list. So to do that, we're going to use insert again. And we know the third position of the list, because we start counting at 0, is actually going to be 2. So we'll put 2 there, and we'll put 30 is what we're trying to add. Okay, save it. Let's run it. And again, we've got 30 there in the third position of the list. Okay. Let's add the elements 50 to the end of the list. And to do that, we use the append. Function. And so 50 is at the end here. And let's go ahead and run that again. So we've got E5, and again, you notice 50 is at the very end. And lastly, just like we did before, let's print out the index. Using a for loop, let's print out the index and elements of the list. So let's create that header again that we had before. And we'll say index, and we'll say elements, and we'll say for I in range len YouTube, and we'll say print I, tab that over, and YouTube bracket I. Okay, let's clear that, run that, E5 ends. Now our list looks like this.